Okay, so hello. So we are going to be taking a look today at war academies. Why did the Red Army suffer so many casualties in every battle of World War II? I saw this actually while I was scrolling before I made these videos, just out there on the homepage on YouTube, and I was like, this is actually a pretty good thing for me to at least react to, break down, whatever you call this. So we were going to be doing that. I'll leave the original video link in the description. Go check that out if you don't want the 30-something minute video I'm going to turn this one into. Okay, let's go.
From June 22, 1941 to May 9, 1945, the Red Army is estimated to have had a total of 28 million casualties, according to research by historian David Glantz. Of these 28 million, it is estimated that 10 of them were killed in combat and the remaining 18 million were wounded and taken prisoner. In any case, what is clear is that these figures are completely exorbitant, taking into account that all of them were on the Eastern Front, in the combats that the Soviet Union had with Germany and its allies. On the other hand, the Germans had about 8 million type casualties, to which can be added another million suffered by their allies, among which the Romanian, Italian, Finnish or Hungarian armies stand out. In any case, after subtracting the casualties that Germany had on the Western Front, the figure is reduced to 6,200,000, these being the casualties that the German army had against the Soviets. And it is that it was either attacking or defending. Whether it was in 1941 with everything against them or in 1945 with everything in their favor, Soviet casualties were always very high. But how was
Now that is a true statement. Okay, so again, the numbers, everyone has different numbers on casualties for the Eastern Front. Okay, but roughly, I'll agree with the numbers for the sake of the video. Now this is true. The Soviets definitely suffered a higher casualty rate, basically than any other Allied power during World War II. Now they were taking the brunt of the German war machine on the Eastern Front. Another thing to keep in mind here is that Russian tactics and strategy um, did not overly were not overly concerned with the lives of their soldiers. Okay, this does not mean they threw them away um, willingly or like charge a machine gun until you all die and then take the machine gun. It's not like that. It's they would assault positions and do certain things that would lead to higher casualty rates when if they had more ordnance or more time or more tactical flexibility or better chain of command, they would take less. And this just compounds basically for the 4 years that they fight in the war.
this possible? What is it that led the Red Army to have so many millions of casualties? What was your Achilles heel? Next, to answer these questions, we have divided the different years in which the Red Army was fighting against the Wehrmacht into 4 stages, and we are going to analyze how many casualties they had in each of them, and what were their keys. In the first place, we have the first phase that we have established in the first months of this Clash of the Titans, these being the months that go from June 1941 to December. In this period, which is barely 5.5 months old, the Red Army suffered some 4,500,000 casualties, these being higher than the number of soldiers that the Germans had calculated that the Soviet army had. Undoubtedly, this phase was characterized by a terrible direction in the Soviet command, and by a total rigidity in the command, which prevented the Soviet units from carrying out withdrawals and withdrawals. Let us remember that the Red Army had just been purged by Stalin, which focused especially on the officer corps. Thus, the Soviet armies were encircled over and over again, losing almost 2.5 million troops in the different encirclements that the Germans carried out. Finally, this phase was characterized by a series of desperate Soviet counteroffensives, which led them to suffer excessive casualties, in an attempt to stop the German advance. Secondly, we have stage number 2.
All right, so let's just break down stage 1 real quick again. So I'll just take a look at their map they have. So again, it's like around 4 million casualties. We'll go off of what they say here, okay? Now, here it is. There's the map. All right, so break down phase 1. Okay, so it's 1941. The Soviet Union has, up to this point, okay, let's break down what has happened. In the 30s, Stalin did the purge of the officers, okay? He basically killed, sacked, removed all officers from basically field grade level all the way to general level. Okay, company level he kind of left alone mostly, but field grade officers and then general officers all of them basically, most of them got sacked or fired or killed or whatever. Put one of those things in there, okay? Now, when you lose that level of commanders, that takes years, decades to replace, okay? They didn't have decades. The purge occurred in like I believe 36, 35 ish. Um, and it went on for a while. And the Red Army was vast; their officer corps was decimated. Okay, so they need to rebuild it with ideological people that are loyal to Stalin, because of course that's what you have to do. So that takes decades to get to the general level. The generals to basically reacquire generals because all of them are gone. That takes decades that they didn't have. So then we walk into the Finnish Soviet War in the 1940s. The Finns kicked the Soviets' ass. Okay, there's really no other way around it. They kick their ass. Then the Soviets finally get their head out of the hand out of the snow and be like, "Oh yeah, that's right. I have armored divisions. Why don't we just drive them up the road and go take Finland's capital?" And that's what they did. And then the war ended and Finland lost their territory. So then the Soviets, attacked Poland in 1940 after the Winter War. So that happens. Or sorry, wow, I'm getting confused because the invasion of Poland happened, but again, this is a minor thing. The Soviet Union kind of just walked into Poland and didn't suffer many casualties at all. Okay, so that happens. Then the Winter War happens. Then they're like, "Ha ha, we have a very good army. We are all okay." And then the Germans attack and basically decimate them. Stalin famously had a breakdown, right? And I fully believe that he had a breakdown and just shut himself in and was like, "Hi, this is not happening. Oh my god." So that happened. So none of his generals from basically Moscow could give orders to the guys in the field because, of course, you can't. And then the guys in the field are like, "Hey, can we like return fire or do anything?" And the orders were basically, "No, you have to sit there." So that's why the German offensive happened, even though people went over the border from the German side and told the Soviets, "Hey, there's an attack coming. You need to do something," and they didn't. So basically, all the Soviet aircraft got destroyed. The Soviets were attacked. Commanders couldn't figure out what was going on. The commanders that could figure out what was going on asked to be able to do stuff, and they were told bluntly no. So that leads to encirclements and massive amounts of casualties. Okay, that's massive amounts of casualties. Remember, all these guys are, somewhat trained soldiers. You can't usually replace those people very fast, if at all. And all of them are gone. So, yeah, it's not very good. And then, as he said, the counterattack that the Soviets will do later, basically talking about basically the Battle of Moscow because they got near it enough, on the outskirts of Moscow. And they basically were trying to just slow the Germans down with counterattacks that weren't very good, but the one that in Moscow actually did stall them and delay them enough to not take the capital city.
Different encirclements that the Germans carried out. Finally, this phase was characterized by a series of desperate Soviet counteroffensives, which led them to suffer excessive casualties in an attempt to stop the German advance. Secondly, we have stage number 2, in which the Soviets go on a general offensive along the entire front, later suffering the attack on their southern flank in the Caucasus. This period would go from approximately December 1941 to April 1943, occupying a total of 17 months. According to David Glantz, in this phase the Red Army suffered 9 million casualties, of which 3,500,000 were killed. At this stage we have to highlight Stalin's counterattack orders on the entire front, with the intention of expelling the Germans from their territory. In the first place there were the offensives that began in November in the vicinity of Rostov, and continued in December in Moscow and Leningrad. These attacks were successful for the Soviets, and they managed to expel the Germans from Rostov and prevent them from taking Moscow.
And when this attack happened around here, basically the Germans exhausted everything trying to get to the capital because, again, the German generals thought if you take Moscow, war ends. Funnily enough, Hitler's like, maybe we should go for the oil. That'd be a better idea. But again, what worked in France will work in Russia. Of course it will. But besides that point, so basically the German army is spread very thin on positions that it can't hold. Generals basically asked, "Hey, can we pull back to positions that we can hold?" So that's why there's just bulges in the line, and then again the Soviets will basically close them off, right? And that's what happens. So there's a lot of fighting, and the Soviets have better winter equipment because the Germans didn't think it'd be until winter. They didn't think they'd be there that long. So winter comes and they're like, well, we don't have any food, we don't have any ammo, we don't have winter clothing, yada yada yada. The offensive happens. Okay, now this phase, technically, as he states, is he broke them up into. So it goes into 42 and 43. So 42, what happens? Battle of Stalingrad. Okay, and then it goes into 43. Um, so yeah, you can see how that Battle of Stalingrad will lead to a massive amount of casualties. But we'll keep going.
Rostov and prevent them from taking Moscow. However, they did not achieve the objective of provoking a total defeat or driving them back to outside their territory. One of the keys to these offensives was that they took place in winter with extreme weather conditions, and at a time when the Germans had reached their logistical limit. However, while they pushed the Germans back, the Soviet offensive tactics were still very rudimentary, and they made a lot of mistakes. Finally, and after suffering many casualties, the Eastern Front was stabilized in March 1942. Subsequently, the Soviets launched an attack on Kharkov in May of that same year, where it was shown that they still had a lot to learn, and ended up with most of their troops surrounded by the Germans. Then, at the end of June 1942, the Germans began Operation Blue, again advancing hundreds of kilometers into the Caucasus.
Again, we think with the offensive, right? Because basically, the Soviet army, it's not just Russia, the Soviet army had been getting its basically pounded from 41 all the way into 42. And the winter offensive, basically of 41 going into 42, was able to basically counterattack the Germans. The problem was, as I mentioned earlier, all the general officers and field officers were, dead or gone, and then all of the ones that were replacing them were also died because the 4 million casualties they suffered in the beginning of the war. You can't replace those guys, so they needed to gain the experience again very fast. You can do so during war, but you have to spend blood, and the Soviets had plenty of blood to spill, so they did. And then again, they're building up basically deep battle, which is what Russia tried to do in Ukraine recently, and that didn't go very well. But it did work during World War II, and it does work, and it's actually a good idea, but it has to be implemented properly with again proper field commanders that know what they're doing, have the ability to do so, have the flexibility, yada yada yada. Okay. Now, 42 happens. Basically, the cards flip again, and the Germans go on the offensive in 42 into Stalingrad. This is basically their last Hail Mary, okay? After this, they're out of resources. It ain't happening. You could say Battle of Kursk, like 1943 was like their genius at that point, but no. 42, 43 was a break year, if you call it that, or maybe 41, depending if they didn't get to Moscow, but let's just say 42, okay? 42 in Stalingrad, okay? 42, 43 Stalingrad. They spent all their resources trying to capture Stalingrad. It doesn't work. Okay, but the Soviets had to spend a massive amount of resources and blood of their own to stop them.
It was here that things began to change, and the Red Army was not so rigid and inflexible. So, after stopping the Germans at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, they again moved into a massive counterattack along the entire front. However, of the 4 major operations they launched that winter, only the Uranus and Saturn operations went well, ultimately suffering defeat with Manstein's counteroffensive at Kharkov. Meanwhile, the North Star and Mars operations failed resoundingly. In any case, and in global terms, in this period they managed to turn the war around completely, and they managed to leave the Germans breathless. Although all the combats that we have just mentioned were very hard, the worst for the Soviets was yet to come. These occurred specifically during the months from July 1943 to June 1944, before starting the Bagration operation. And it is that during this third period of just 12 months, the Red Army once again suffered another 8,500,000 casualties, 2 million of them due to deaths. It was here that major battles were fought in which the Soviets made virtually no tactical errors as in previous years, although they were still fighting a very capable German army. Battles like Kursk, the end of the siege of Leningrad, or the crossing of the Dnieper and the subsequent advance towards Romania and the Carpathians marked this stage.
So, 1943, 1944 for the Soviet army, they are getting to their stage of basically Operation Migration and kicking Germans' ass in 45, okay? But they're having to push the Germans that are very well, at this point, going to be entrenched, and they're having to attack, okay? The Germans basically at this point from 43, Kursk onward, basically sit there and take blows because they can't. I mean, they literally can't launch any more general offensives in the East. It just ain't gonna happen. It's not like it was in 41 and 42. They can't do it anymore. So the Soviets are going to be attacking the Germans. The Germans do very well with their elastic defense, okay, against Soviets. Again, both sides are countering both sides during this, and the Soviets have to continuously push, and this is going to lead to higher casualties. Attackers always take higher casualties than the defender. It just happens because defending is easier most of the time. Um, War in Ukraine, for example, right now. And when they do this, again, they're still developing their doctrines and everything that will be happening, but it is just a bloodbath. It is a slog on the Eastern Front from 43 to 44. The Soviets are starting to get the economy rolling to start really ramping up and producing a massive amount of equipment that they're going to need for 44, the late stages of 44 and 45.
As we have said, they were combats in which the German army was still powerful and sold every meter of the front dearly. Thus, these high casualties are the result of numerous offensives along the entire Eastern Front line, in which, with the exception of the Soviet counterattack at Oral, Kursk, and the Donetsk Basin, the Soviets attacked a German army that was to the defensive. And finally we have the last stage, in which the Soviets attacked a German army, which was already fighting hard on the Western Front in France, and on the Italian, and which had already lost most of its capacity over the previous years. Although we may think that this last stage in which the Germans were already close to being defeated was easy for the Soviets, the number of casualties suffered is again very high.
Okay, so the last stage of the war, let's talk about this. So those from the 644 to basically the end of the war 45. So as he correctly states, German, so from again 42, 43, the last stage, the Soviet army is basically fighting the entirety of the German army. Again, the Germans were in Italy, right, holding off the Allies, but you don't need as many divisions there, okay, to hold Italy because it's very mountainous terrain and there's a lot of factors in Italy, but you don't need that many divisions to hold it. But the Allies land in Normandy and are taking France. So Germany does actually have to shift a lot of divisions from the east to the west. When they do this, they lose the ability to defend very well, as they did in 43 on the Eastern Front. Okay. So let's just call it like 30, 40, 50% of their divisions are now gone. Okay. Because they had to go to the Western Front and they have to go to Italy. Okay. So the Germans are already weak. They're already having their massive oil problem that I've done videos on by Tick. You can go check those out. But they're already having massive oil shortages at this point. Their equipment is being bombed by Allied bombers. How effective those are depends. But it's still taking an impact. The Allied blockade is taking an impact. And they can't replace their equipment anymore. And their soldiers, again, Germany has a smaller population than the Soviet Union, so they're taking casualties that they can't replace. All of these factors start compounding on Germany. And even with all of those factors, Germany fights like a rabid dog in a corner, okay? They fight to the last man on the Eastern Front, okay? There are units, and again, jumping a little bit ahead, there are units that try after Berlin falls that run, drop everything and run to the Western Allies, okay? Because it was an ideological war between the Soviets and the Germans, okay? Or Germany, on the Eastern Front. And the Germans, did lots of war atrocities on the Eastern Front. They thought the exact same thing would happen. To be fair, it did when the commissars showed up and started executing German soldiers and officers and SS and all those guys, okay? So they were fighting basically to the death. Both of them were, the Soviet Union and Germany. So that's why they held on for so long, longer than anyone really thought they had the right ought to.
And this time they have less justification than ever. And it is that in total, another 6 million Soviets caused loss during these last 11 months, being of them 1,200,000 deaths. The main battles of this phase were those that occurred during Operation Bagration, the Courland Pocket, the conquest of Romania, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Vistula-Oder offensive, and the final crossing of the latter river and the immediate Battle of Berlin.
Now, this is the phase that you could very much argue that the Soviets did not need to spend this amount of blood to push the Germans this far, okay? Or do it as fast. And I would agree with you. The Soviets took horrendous casualties in this phase, okay? Now they would still take a lot of casualties, but it did not need to be as bloody. So this Kurland pocket, okay, there's actually, I think there's a sleeve insignia for Kurland. I don't know, I forgot, but basically Kurland is going to be this Riga Estonia era. This area will be completely cut off during Operation Migration. The Soviets will push and completely cut off this entire pocket. The German army, of course, won't withdraw because why would they? Because that would make sense. So there's like 1.2 something million soldiers that are just trapped up there. Okay, then you have the Soviet army continuously pushing towards Berlin. Okay, they also start pushing Romania and all the other places, and it basically Bulgaria and all the are just basically collapse because, being very honest, the Eastern Front is basically just the German-Soviet war. Now, Romanians, Bulgarians, and Hungarians did fight, and some of them did very well. Even the Italians with their Italian cavalry did very well. But again, they do not make up anywhere near the numbers of Germans um, on the Eastern Front. So those are also happening. But because Stalin wanted to be the very first person into Berlin and take it all, he ordered commanders to ruthlessly attack the Germans, no matter the casualty rates. Okay, this happened. They took extraordinary casualty rates. If they went slower, more methodically, they wouldn't have suffered as many casualties. They wouldn't have got to Berlin as fast either. So there's that.
In the immediate Battle of Berlin. Without a doubt, there were many battles in which the Soviets assaulted German defensive positions, which they were able to break through with relative ease, due to the weakness of the last German armies and their precarious situation. However, despite the fact that the Germans had less and less trained recruits, as well as fewer panzer units capable of carrying out strong counterattacks, these were troops that defended their native country, and they fought with great ferocity. On the other hand, the Soviets raised many of these offensives in an accelerated manner, and in a certain hurry to reach Berlin before their Western allies. Thus, and from my point of view, the large number of Soviet casualties in this period was due to unjustified haste, in which it was essential to comply with a calendar instead of common sense.
No, that is somewhat true. Okay, so again, getting to Germany ends the war faster, right? You get to Berlin. Sorry, you get to Berlin, you end the war faster, technically, but they are going to suffer extraordinary casualties here, especially in the Battle of Berlin. You see the Silo Heights, the Battle of the Silo Heights, extraordinary casualties for the Soviets. Okay, they. One of the things is they try a new technology. They're going to use lights, like those lights in a lighthouse, right? Those sea lights. They're going to use those to blind the German defenders on Silo Heights. Okay, so they get all these lights together, right? After an artillery bombardment that blows the Silo Heights to hell. Then they pop these lights that show at the Silo Heights, and then they tell their Soviet soldiers to advance. The problem is the Soviet soldiers can't see anything because the lights are behind them, so they look behind them and then they're blinded, right? And you want to know what the Germans see? The Germans see silhouetted targets moving towards them that are completely lit up, so they mow them down. Again, tactical genius, not amazing, but the speed that the Soviets had, the speed that the Soviets went at to accomplish the objective of getting to Berlin first, and the competition basically between um, Zhukov and Ivan, I believe. I can't remember his last name. But there's two field commanders. He's like Soviets. Stalin was like, "Meh, who gets to Berlin first? We shall see." And these two don't work together very well and want to accomplish the objective, i.e., surround Berlin. They basically want to get there first. Which one of us will get there first? Right? So they throw bodies at the problem, again, at a hastened pace, which leads to extraordinary casualties. So he is right on that the accelerated position of the calendar really did lead to a lot of Soviet casualties, especially at the end in 45.
Period was due to unjustified haste, in which it was essential to comply with a calendar instead of common sense. The Battle of the Silo Hills and the subsequent battle for Berlin are perhaps the best examples of this. And it is that, what sense does it make to attack with such ferocity a garrison that is already defeated? Why didn't they just let their enemy starve, or come under fire from their aircraft and artillery? Why was the date of May 1st set as the day on which the Reichstag had to be taken? Well, although obviously not all, many of these casualties were the result of a political and ideological imposition instead of using military common sense. Once these four phases have been analyzed,
I'll back up a minute, okay? Let's talk about I don't. They weren't gonna starve Germany out or Berlin out. That's not gonna happen. Okay. So what really could have happened and was in the original battle plan could have happened very easily was to surround Berlin. Okay, give you that. The generals work together. They surround Berlin. Okay, Germany's not surrounded. Now you bombard the living hell out of Berlin until they surrender, which is basically what the Soviet Union did, except they went even faster. Again, more generals working together instead of on a timetable, and instead of whoever takes Berlin gets the glory, right? Um, would have helped reduce the amount of casualties the Soviets suffered in 45. I don't think you would starve them out, in all honesty. You might if you waited that long, but again, there are certain timetables you do have to meet. The Allies are still coming. Okay, if you see it from Stalin's perspective, I know, getting into the mind of a madman, but he wants to take Berlin first because the Soviets were attacked by Germany, and he wants to put the Soviet flag on the Reichstag, and that will be the Soviet pride forever. So, and he did it, not the Western Allies. At least from his perspective, that's what it would be. And technically, you still could have done it, right? Instead of meeting a ridiculous timetable, if you took your time a little bit slower, circled the city, bombarded the city, moved methodically, you still would have taken the same thing. Would have reduced casualty numbers, but it's not what Papa Stalin wanted.
Once these four phases have been analyzed, we can indicate the following keys that, in general terms, caused the Red Army to suffer these 28 million casualties. First of all, a rigid and inexperienced command during the first months.
I agree. Okay. First phase, I'll agree. I've gone over why the Soviet army was like that, from the purges, and what happened to the officers. So we'll agree. Tactical inflexibility, and they couldn't do what they needed to do.
A series of continuous massive offensives throughout the front line, which were not always well organized.
Now, that is true. Going on again, a mass offensive against the entire line just doesn't work. They start doing more serried offensives, right? So they'll be like, hey, this offensive's going off. So, for example, in 44, 45, Operation Migration, okay? That's one. Then in the south, there will be an operation to take all of Romania and Bulgaria and knock them out of the war, right? Then there'll be another operation to knock Hungary out of the war. So they start doing that instead of just whole general line offensives against the German army. And the reason they do that is because you can concentrate or move divisional artillery, which is what the Soviets actually did. They had entire divisions of artillery that they would move, right, to where they were needed. So from operations in the north, they'll move them to the south. If the Beg operation happens, then that artillery will be moved to the third operation in Hungary, right? Then that'll happen, and then they'll move it back up to the Operation 1 to take Berlin, right? So that gives you more flexibility with the equipment that you can use. So the Soviets, again, learn this after the general offensives in 41, 42, and 43. And then 43, they really start getting good at it.
A certain detachment from saving lives in order to achieve any objective, no matter how small. Hate.
That is true. And that is true because the Soviet Union had commissars. So I hate ideological officers because they make no sense and they're stupid, right? If you have a Soviet squad leader and a commissar, right, and the Soviet squad leader is like, hey, we need to pull back, we need to suppress that position, and then we need to go around it, right? And then you have the political officer next to him say that has no military education whatsoever, but went to communism school, or in Germany, or Germany's case, Nazi school, whatever you have, right? And he's like, no, you will attack that machine gun head on. I will watch you. And he's like, that's stupid. And then the commissar pulls out a 40 pistol and shoots the sergeant in the head, and then says, attack. And everyone attacks, and they all die, right? So that's one thing, okay? Leading to casualties, again, commissars, to politically motivate the men.
Haste and accelerated attacks. And lastly, and this being the most important of all, they faced a German army that either in 1941 or even in 1945 was a totally effective army and that did not forgive its rivals any failure if their resources and circumstances they allowed it. So, and in my view,
I'll say that the 44 to 45.5 he makes, the German army was a very tough opponent, okay? There's no doubt about it. Germany, World War II wouldn't have lasted as long if Germany was not an insane opponent to go up against, okay? So give them that. That Germany was dogged in their defense. But in 44, 45, they were running out of everything to pull off the Soviets, okay? They were scraping together what they could, and with what they could, they were able to hold off the Soviets a little bit. But they were still bleeding while they were doing it.
they allowed it. So, and in my view, all these elements together were the ones that caused this high number of casualties. Would you add any more? If you want to go deeper into this matter, I leave you in the description the program that we did with Carlos Caballero Jurado about the last year of the war, in which you can see how these final fierce attacks were.
So I'll leave the video there and say that if you speak Spanish, you can go watch that video. Again, I'll put the link to this video in the description so you can go check out what he's talking about there. Okay. You have to speak Spanish because I tried with subtitles and it doesn't work for English. But hey, there you go. I'd go look at that if you can speak Spanish and understand it. All right. So hope you guys liked this format thing Majigger I did. I don't know if I'll react to more of his stuff or not. Depends if you guys like this stuff. All right. So hope you guys learned something from my rambling, and I'll see you people next time. See you later.